anyone who's had a chance to explore Utah's portion of the Colorado river system knows how precious it is to all of us and the value it gives us, both as citizens and those that just enjoy being around it. Not only is our history intertwined as the state of Utah with the Colorado system, but we also look at it in terms of our warming climate and the human increased demand that constantly is placed on it. Here to present about the past, present, and the future of this vital river system is Colorado River expert Jack Schmidt. Professor Schmidt is a professor of watershed sciences here at Utah State University. He's been on our faculty since 1991, and he is without question a national expert on the Colorado River system and its surrounding ecology system. Dr. Schmidt has published widely on this, and he's been known to make some strong visionary thoughts about directions we should take, and I'm sure he will disappoint today. He has served as chief of the U.S. Geological Survey Grand Canyon Monitoring and Research Center. He did that from 2011 to 2014. It's a primary agency supporting the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program. He's a prolific speaker. In fact, he just drove up here from Grand Junction, Colorado, where he was speaking yesterday, and he's constantly on the stump talking about his vision, his concerns, and his focus on the Colorado. So please help welcome Jack Schmidt to this day.
Well, it's great to be with you this morning. I'm going to spend a little time with you and talk to you about the Colorado River. Colorado River system is Utah's biggest river. It's a long ways from the Wasatch Front, but it is Utah's biggest river, and it is critically important to us here in Utah, and you'll get a sense of all this. This is a photograph of the Colorado River in its delta in Mexico in the early part of the 20th century. This is an exact match of that photograph today. So my point is we have hope for the Colorado River. You might wonder why we would have hope, and that's one of my messages today after showing you that photo match. So I want to spend a few minutes talking about why to have hope, and then I want to talk about the role of science and engineering research, including that carried out at Utah State University in finding that hope. One of the fundamental attributes of the Colorado River in the discussions we have about the river is that we often talk past each other. There are two different kinds of conversations we have about the Colorado River. The primary one we talk about is the Colorado River as the commodity water. It's a commodity which is moved through a plumbing system. This is a decades-old characterization of the Colorado River as a series of valves and storage areas and funnels. This characterization is famous, has been with us for probably 40 years. And this is the long domain of the engineering profession, lawyers, the political domain, economists, and everybody who cares about how water is distributed in the Intermountain West and the far west in California, who has rights to what, and what that future distribution will be like. And the perception is this is the perspective that drives discussions about the Colorado River and its future. Of course, the Colorado River system is also one of the most majestic, if not the most majestic river system that we have in the United States. Not only in Grand Canyon, but elsewhere. This is a photograph of the Yampa River in Dinosaur National Monument. And so the Colorado River is also something to discuss as we talk about the Colorado River as river ecosystem. And often we talk past each other. Today, in the world that I've had my career as a river scientist, I've sort of worked on this end and talked about what rivers need to remain healthy and vibrant. But the nexus, the future is talking to each other, and that's what I want to visit with you about. The fundamental geographic attribute of the Colorado River was described by the Colorado River's first famous great river scientist, John Wesley Powell, who made significant contributions to river science, river exploration, and the politics of how water and land is managed in the West. And Powell said, the general course of the river is from north to south and from great altitudes to the level of the sea. Thus it runs from the land of snow to the land of sun. And that is a fundamental attribute of the Colorado River. In this diagram, the width of those segments of the Colorado River are proportional to the mean annual flow, how much water is in the river in each place. And the fundamental attribute is that you can see lots of elements of articulation of the upper part of the river in this diagram, and that's because that's where the water enters the river system. And then, from the confluence of the San Juan River on downstream, you can see that the width of that line doesn't change. The Colorado River is an exotic river. It carries the snowmelt from the distant Rocky Mountains across the arid and semi-arid Colorado Plateau and Basin and Range. The first significant uses of the Colorado River were at its downstream end. And in fact, as has oft been observed, the Colorado River is America's Nile. The Egyptian civilization developed by harnessing the Nile River, whose sources of water are in distant Ethiopia and Uganda. But Egypt makes darn sure that it knows where the water comes from, how much, and who else uses it. And you can invert that and substitute the name California for the name Egypt. But that's the way to think about the Colorado River. Now, the allocation, the broad allocation of water in the Colorado River is organized in this way. The first and highest obligation in the Colorado River is to meet international treaty obligations. And so even though the 1944 US-Mexico Treaty was signed decades after the original Colorado River Compact, meeting international obligations is the highest obligation that the United States has. We work in the English system, and I'm not going to try to change it. This is the language we all speak in. We must deliver at the US-Mexican border 1.5 million acre-feet of water a year. The Colorado River Compact was negotiated in the 1920s. It allocated what negotiators thought was half of the Colorado River water supply to the lower basin, and that water is allocated today to Southern California, the Imperial Valley, Central Arizona, and a small amount to Southern Nevada. The key element of this agreement is that the agreement was written to say that 7.5 million acre-feet a year will be delivered each year to the lower basin, a fixed number. The upper basin was assumed to have access to the other half of a supply that was assumed to be somewhat more, in fact, than the sum of 7.5 plus 7.5. It turns out that we have less than that supply, but the way the agreement is written is that 7.5 million acre feet must be delivered to the lower basin, which means the upper basin gets to distribute what is left. And in 1948, the Upper Colorado River Compact was negotiated. And what's important about this allocation system is you can see that the agreements is expressed in percentages, not absolute numbers. No one really knows how much they have to distribute, and what is important for the future is that if or when the supply of the Colorado River declines, the agreement to deliver a fixed amount in the lower basin is fixed. And the allocation agreements in the upper basin are what will decline. As a professor in Utah, I will nevertheless observe that this arrangement is something that gives the Colorado River hope. And the reason it gives it hope is that this arrangement guarantees that water stays in the river. This river will never be dried up because of the senior water rights and political power at the lower end of the basin. If you want to see a river without hope, go to the Rio Grande. On the Rio Grande, the largest uses are in the upper end, and once you get downstream of El Paso and Juarez, there is no water. Now, all of the water delivered to Mexico now is used for irrigation in the Mexicali Valley, which does in fact mean that the most downstream 60 to 100 miles of the Colorado River have to be walked. The river does not go to the sea except in rare management situations that I'll talk about in a minute. In between where the water comes from and where the water goes is the Grand Canyon. And it is essentially the bottleneck between this collection system and this distribution system. I've also drawn arrows for the uses by the upper basin states and the primary uses in the upper basin. This is the allocation. This is not the amount of water presently used in the Wasatch Front, or in the Front Range, but the primary use of the upper basin water by the state of Colorado is transbasin diversions to the Colorado Front Range. The primary use of water in the state of Utah is ag irrigation in the Uinta Basin and the transfer of many of the headwater streams of the Duchesne River into the Wasatch Front. The Colorado River has hope because much of the Colorado Plateau is the densest concentration of national park and monument units in the United States. And so there is a large focus on the values, the national values of these Park Service and other monument units that keep national attention on the river. The Colorado River has a unique fishery. 75% of the native species of the Colorado River live nowhere else on Earth. They are endemic, and many are endangered. And because of that, there is strong national focus on the health of the river system to try to recover those species. So there is significant concern. And lastly, there's hope for the Colorado River because we are in perceived crisis. This is a significant diagram produced by the federal government which shows the rising historical use of Colorado River water, the ever-changing natural flow of the Colorado River, the anticipation of increasing future demand throughout the basin, and an uncertain future supply, which we increasingly realize is in the lower end of this hazy image of what will happen in the future. It is a significant thing for the federal government to acknowledge that there won't be enough water in the future, and that significant changes and significant negotiations need to go on. Utah State University engineers, David Tarbotton in the Civil Engineering Department, a few others have played a significant role working with the Bureau of Reclamation on some of these projects. Science and engineering have played a long-standing role in understanding this river. This is a photograph of U.S. Geological Survey hydrologists and engineers who in the 1920s launched and carried out a surveying expedition through Grand Canyon to survey potential dam sites in the watershed. In the beginning, science and engineering was all about serving water development interests to identify dam sites and the amount of water that was available to be diverted and how much sediment was transported by the river that might fill up those reservoirs. Continuing science conducted by a whole bunch of people over a whole bunch of decades, and I'm lucky enough to be part of that very large group, have identified the effects of large dams and diversions on river ecosystems, and this is where potentially conflicting interests clash. And we've identified that there are some significant factors that change in rivers as we develop them. The endangered fish of the Colorado River system, many of them were wide-ranging and cruised from Wyoming, and then maybe in the wintertime they wanted to see what things were like down in Yuma, and so they'd cruise down there and they'd go from one end of the river system to the other. The big dams, particularly at Hoover Dam and Glen Canyon Dam, have forever disconnected the river system, and essentially we've lost many of those native species out of the lower end of the basin. So we manage remnant populations. We do have lots of still open water and connected streams in the upper basin. Grand Canyon is sort of cut off from anywhere else. And these dams and large reservoirs change the downstream temperatures of the river, which change spawning cues for fish and change their ability to successfully reproduce. This amount of stream flow in these rivers also greatly changes. In this hydrograph, this is the average hydrograph going well over 100,000 cubic feet per second at Yuma before Hoover Dam was completed. This is the hydrograph of the river today. Even I know that that's a difference, and I don't need any statistics for that. Everything between blue and yellow is the water consumptively used in the United States. But this is really the condition only at the far most distant downstream end of the basin. For most of the basin, we're trying to route water through and downstream to the large users downstream, and so there's a lot of water left in the Colorado River. This is the flow regime in Grand Canyon, and what we deal with there is not an absence of water, but a complete change in the flow regime of the river, how that water is distributed. And the reason why that's a green swath that looks really thick is that actually the river goes up and down every day to produce hydroelectricity to turn on these lights, and then the rivers have been often turned off at night when people don't use it. That's a very different river than the natural flux that included a natural snowmelt flood each year, but then the river being low other times. The Colorado River, in its natural state, delivered more fine sediment to the sea than any other river in North America except the Missouri-Mississippi system. So the river was a conveyor belt of moving sand and mud to the sea as much as it was a water transfer system. And this is an image of the head of Lake Powell near the abandoned Height Marina, which is now abandoned. And this is simply a map of the estimated sediment loads in North America at the time of European settlement. So we have two different kinds of, we have this array of rivers which have changing flow regime, And then we have sediment trapped in reservoirs, and we're releasing clear water downstream. And so in some places, such as Grand Canyon, big sandbars along the side of the river have eroded significantly. These sites have values for both recreation and ecological value, and the fight is how to maintain or restore these sandbars in a river that really just doesn't have very much sediment. 98% of the sand and mud flux that once passed through Grand Canyon is now deposited in Lake Powell. So we're working with a supply that's sort of less than 5% of what we used to work with. But in other places, we've taken all the water out of the river, but sediment still comes in by flash floods into the lower downstream parts of the river, such as the San Rafael River here in Utah, where all of the water that comes out of the Wasatch Plateau is now extensively diverted for irrigation in Castle Valley or consumed in cooling at coal-fired power plants. And virtually no water gets through the San Rafael swell and on down to the Green River. But the San Rafael Desert still has flash floods, and so sediment still comes into that river. And so this is a match photo in the lower end of the San Rafael River, where the river has filled with sediment. So some places the problem is too little sediment, some places the problem is too much sediment. In an effort to try to restore and maintain natural values, the federal government has established a number of large adaptive management programs in the West. These are significant programs. The Grand Canyon program that I ran, the agency that provided the science for that program, our budget was most of that $11 million a year budget to conduct the science related to how flows are managed. So these are significant expenditures. We've instituted some management changes. In Grand Canyon, we've instituted controlled floods in an effort to redistribute sediment when it is available to be redistributed. I was lucky enough to be one of the team who thought this up, and it's a great satisfaction to me to see it implemented now. We've also reduced the range of daily hydro peaking at Glen Canyon, increased the base flows, so we're adjusting and changing the flow regime. Let me talk for a minute about how we implement controlled floods. It really is a wonderful partnership of science and engineering. Our river science and geomorphology identified that a large stream, the Paria River, whose headwaters are in Bryce Canyon National Park, is the primary deliverer of sand to the Colorado River system. Here is Glen Canyon Dam, 15 miles downstream is this confluence. This section has absolutely no sediment and has largely eroded, but we have this sediment coming in here that we try to manage and redistribute to benefit resources in Grand Canyon National Park. We fought hard to implement and sell this idea. We came up with this idea in the early 1990s. It took about 5 years of behind-the-scenes work as a collaboration of university and federal USGS scientists to sell this idea in the political system. I was lucky enough to be at Glen Canyon Dam in 1996 when Secretary Babbitt opened the gates for that first flood. And the great change that was made in this administration was to develop a formal political protocol which said, we know enough science, no more politics, we're going to be scientists and measure how much sand comes in every year, and if it's a good year of monsoon, flash floods, and sand delivery to Grand Canyon, we're going to have a flood, no more politics on this. And the high flow protocol implemented that, and it includes a season when we need to chase floods and figure out how much sand is coming in, and then we need to design the floods. And so this is one of those eddy sandbars, but what's important is the hard work of scientists in the federal government, supported by universities, to measure what's going on and measure it in real time and develop internet, web-based ways to serve that data so that decisions can be made in real time. It flooded in the end of September. Are we going to have a high flow release in early November? Monday, the gates open for this year. Now, I've outlined a number of strategies for what we might do at dams to improve the downstream environment. And I've highlighted in yellow the changes that we've implemented already. Most of those changes have to do with changing how hydroelectricity is produced. We're producing, frankly, less hydroelectricity at those dams for the benefit of the downstream environment. We can discuss later the value of that and the cost-benefit trade-off. We've changed the temperatures of releases at Flaming Gorge Dam. We've implemented controlled floods. There are bigger changes we could implement, and those are the ones we don't yet implement. We know that Grand Canyon doesn't have enough sediment in it. We actually know how much it would cost to route sediment around Glen Canyon Dam. Those are large numbers. If you divide them by $10 million a year, which is the Glen Canyon Dam Adaptive Management Program budget of the agency I ran, you can decide whether that really is a big number or not. But it's fair to say there's not a societal consensus to do this. But we at least know what these things cost. Lastly, I want to take a few minutes and point out that some ideas have been very controversial, but we still have to undertake the heavy lifting of scientific work to evaluate whether controversial ideas like partially or fully draining Lake Powell make sense. I've undertaken that effort in the last 6 months through the Center for Colorado River Studies. This is a map of what Lake Powell would look like in red at minimum power pool, which is the lowest elevation that still produces hydroelectricity. The reservoir would be 30% of what its surface area is at full pool. Frankly, even without an environmental recommendation, the upper basin states are struggling to figure out ways to make sure Glen Canyon Dam stays at minimum power pool. We may have our hand forced on that issue regardless of what comes with climate change. Reducing the reservoir elevation to dead pool would be highly controversial. And what we've identified is that there would be profound changes in Grand Canyon if we lowered Glen Canyon Dam, because the engineering structure of the facilities that release water downstream are limited in their ability to send water downstream. And in a modeling effort in which blue is a natural hydrograph of the Colorado River flooding into Glen Canyon, in red would be what the flow regime in Grand Canyon would be from a partially drained Lake Powell. And it's nowhere near, it's not even remotely close to a natural flow regime. The assertion that we would recreate a natural river in Grand Canyon with a partially drained Lake Powell is simply impossible, because we can't release water through the dam in an efficient way. We would literally have to drill new diversion tunnels through the sandstone to do that. This is a longitudinal profile with high vertical exaggeration. The dam is here. This is 200 kilometers, 150 miles upstream from the dam. And these are the bed profiles of the Colorado River in different years. In black is the original old Colorado River stream bed. And in color is today's pattern, because in the upper end, those are the deltas. That's where Lake Powell is filling with sediment. And this is the elevation that Lake Powell would be at in these different partially drained phases. And another struggle of partially draining the lake is that the sediment from here will erode and form new deltas within Glen Canyon. The releases into Grand Canyon will still be clear water. We won't get out of that dilemma. In the interest of time, the other analyses that I've undertaken, empowered by the science of the federal government and universities such as ours, demonstrate that if we preferentially stored water in Lake Mead, there would be no net change in evaporation in the system. That is a significant finding. No one had really looked at the data. We've looked at changes in the groundwater patterns around Lake Powell, and we estimate that we would save on the order of 30 to 50,000 acre-feet a year if Lake Powell were not held at a high level. The struggle there is that that's a small number. That's not a big number. The environmental community has asserted this value is about 300,000 acre-feet a year. That's a big number to get people's attention. 30,000 is not. But what we've identified is the science that underpins much of these analyses is very old science. And we're calling for a new wave of federal investment in understanding evaporation and bank seepage out of Lake Powell to compare with Lake Mead so we can understand in the future what is the best way to go forward. We're asserting the uncertainty is too great now. We shouldn't move forward, but we're also not in a position to make accurate and precise measurements. And we need to go forward with new research. That Lake Powell idea might seem like a crazy idea, but I want to conclude by saying that when about 5 of us decided that floods would be a good thing in a river that didn't have much sediment, people walked out of the room and told us we were crazy. And now it's the way we're going to restore sandbars. And when environmental groups and scientists at the University of Arizona proposed to release water into the dry streambed of the Colorado River in the Delta in Mexico, people walked out of the room and said they were crazy. And they said it's the right thing to do, it's the right thing to do for environmental justice, and it's the right thing to do for the environment. And they were told they were crazy. And in 2014, we released just that kind of pulse flow because scientists doggedly worked with decision makers in a respectful and empowering way to figure out how to go forward to do the right thing. We work in alliance with government science to address the needs of all groups in society. I assert that scientists are not merely the people who answer agency questions that agencies want to have answered. Our job is also to tell agencies and the public what questions they ought to be asking. And that's why I think that a university must address questions even as far-fetched as the Phil Mead first proposal, because it is our job to distinguish good ideas from bad ideas, flesh them out. We're all on the same team. We all want America to be a good place. No, I'm dead serious. We pit ourselves between the states and the environment. I just couldn't say it. But the point is, I genuinely believe we're on the same team, and I generally know that there's no way to go forward without that. And so I want to leave you with the fact that the Colorado River is hope because there's water in 98% of it. The only place you really have to get truly creative is down in Mexico, and we're finding a way to do it. Science-based strategies have been implemented to improve ecosystems, and scientists are leading the way to do that. The most important changes to date affect hydropower. That's the easy whipping boy right now. We need to consider the more controversial issues of how to distribute and redistribute water supplies. That's more controversial, and sometimes university scientists need to go it alone to point the way to the future, make ideas a little bit more acceptable, finding out a few more pathways, and then say, okay, now let's make that acceptable. How do we implement it? I want to remind us that good ideas don't always start out seeming like good ideas, but you have to have the courage to come up with crazy ideas before they'll ever become a good idea. And we need to ask the questions that agencies ask of us today, and we need to be one step ahead of everybody if we're going to get ourselves out of this jam in the future. Thanks.